In the past 12 months, Canada signed 20 economic and security partnerships across 5 continents. 20 agreements, 5 continents, 12 months. To put that in perspective, negotiations of this scale typically take 7 to 10 years to complete. Something has fundamentally shifted. My name is Hostname, and today I am going to do something the headlines are not doing. I am not going to tell you what Mark Carney said. I am going to tell you what it means and, more importantly, what it will cost, who benefits, and whether Canada can actually deliver on it. Because here's the thing about ambitious policy announcements: the vision is always clean, the execution never is. Carney stood in front of Canada's business elite in Vancouver and laid out 3 targets that would reshape this country's economic architecture for the next decade: double non-US exports, double electricity generation, 22 nation-building infrastructure projects, 1/3 of them right here in British Columbia. Bold, absolutely achievable. That is the question no one in that room was asking out loud. I lost sleep thinking about the gap between what was promised and what the numbers actually support. Stay with me, because the real story starts right now. Let me be precise about what happened and when. On May 22, 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed a gathering of Canada's business leadership in Vancouver, British Columbia. This was not a campaign speech. This was not a press conference. This was a strategic policy address delivered to the people who move capital, build infrastructure, and make long-term investment decisions in this country. And the message was structured around one central argument: Canada is open, Canada is stable, and Canada is ready to do business with the world on Canada's terms. Now let me translate that for you, because those 3 sentences sound like marketing language. Underneath them is a set of concrete policy commitments that deserve serious examination. The first commitment is trade diversification. Carney's government has set a target to double Canada's non-US exports within this decade. According to figures cited in the address, that represents over 300 billion Canadian dollars in new orders for Canadian resources, goods, and expertise. Active negotiations are currently underway with India, ASEAN member states, Thailand, the Philippines, and Mercosur, the South American trading bloc that includes Brazil and Argentina. Canada already holds existing free trade agreements with South Korea, the European Union through CETA, and multiple Pacific economies through the CPTPP framework. The new push is designed to deepen and expand on those existing foundations. The second commitment is energy. Carney positioned Canada as a future low-risk, low-cost, and low-carbon energy supplier for global markets. Canada's electricity demand is projected to double over the next 25 years, driven by industrial expansion and the accelerating energy requirements of artificial intelligence infrastructure. The government's response is a commitment to double domestic electricity generation to meet that demand. Projects referenced in the address include LNG Canada, the Darlington Nuclear Facility, and the Mackenzie Valley Highway, a corridor that has been discussed for decades and is now, according to Carney, moving from discussion to active construction within 6 to 12 months. The third commitment is infrastructure. 22 nation-building projects have been referred to a dedicated major projects office within the federal government. 1/3 of those 22 projects are located in British Columbia. The Port of Vancouver, which currently handles more cargo than the next 5 largest Canadian ports combined, processing approximately $1 billion in trade every single day with 170 countries, is central to this plan. Carney stated directly that doubling non-US exports requires growing the capacity of that port, including the rail, road, and airport infrastructure feeding into it. Now here is where I need you to pay close attention. These 3 commitments are not independent of each other. They are designed as an interconnected system. Energy credibility unlocks trade relationships. Trade relationships justify infrastructure investment. Infrastructure investment makes energy export physically possible. It is a logical chain, and on paper, it is coherent. but a logical chain is only as strong as its weakest link. The International Energy Agency, cited directly in Carney's address, described Canada as having a golden opportunity with, and I am paraphrasing here carefully, many cards to play in the global energy transition. That is a credible external signal. The IEA does not use that kind of language without analytical basis. However, and this is the part that does not make the highlight reel's opportunity and execution are two entirely different categories. Carney is describing what Canada could become. What I want to examine next is what Canada would need to overcome to actually get there, because there is a variable sitting inside this plan that almost nobody in that room addressed out loud, and it changes everything. Here is what the applause in that room drowned out. Every single target Carney announced on May 22, 2025 depends on one assumption holding true. The assumption that Canada's existing systems, its ports, its power grid, its regulatory processes, its diplomatic relationships can scale at a speed this country has never demonstrated before. Let me show you exactly where the pressure points are. Start with the Port of Vancouver. $1 billion in trade per day, 170 countries. Already the largest cargo handler in Canada by a significant margin. Carney himself acknowledged that doubling non-U.S. exports requires growing this port's capacity, including rail, road, and airport infrastructure across the entire lower mainland. That is not a small upgrade. That is a fundamental expansion of physical infrastructure in one of the most geographically constrained and environmentally sensitive corridors in North America. The mountains are to the north, the U.S. border is to the south. Indigenous land rights, environmental assessments, and municipal jurisdictions all intersect at this exact location. Carney said Canada needs to move in a coordinated fashion, in partnership with First Nations, respecting environmental responsibilities. Those are not empty words. They are also not fast words. Coordination at that scale, done properly, takes years. Now look at the trade negotiations. Canada's ongoing discussions with India are a case study in exactly this problem. Negotiations between the two countries were suspended in 2023 following a serious diplomatic rupture. As of 2025, those talks are resuming, but the underlying tensions that caused the suspension have not been fully resolved. One analyst framing worth considering: the speed of any India-Canada agreement will be determined less by economic logic and more by the political temperature between Ottawa and New Delhi at any given moment. Mercosur presents a different challenge. The European Union spent more than 20 years negotiating a trade agreement with that bloc before reaching a concluded deal. Canada is signaling it intends to move faster. That ambition is worth tracking, but it is not yet a signed document. And then there is the electricity commitment. Doubling Canada's electricity generation over 25 years requires not just building new generation capacity. It requires upgrading transmission infrastructure across provinces that operate largely independent grids. It requires federal-provincial coordination on a scale that has historically been one of Canada's most persistent political friction points. Here is the variable that reframes everything. Canada's ability to deliver on this vision is not primarily a question of whether the world wants what Canada is offering. Based on available signals, there is genuine international interest in Canadian energy, Canadian resources, and Canadian stability. The binding constraint is internal. It is regulatory velocity. It is intergovernmental coordination. It is the gap between a federal announcement and a provincial construction permit. Carney is not wrong about the opportunity, but the opportunity has an expiration date. The window for Canada to position itself as a reliable alternative supplier in global energy and trade markets will not remain open indefinitely. Other resource-rich, politically stable countries are making the same calculation right now, which means the next question is the most important one. What is actually moving and what is still just moving on paper? Let me put on the translator hat now. Because what gets said in a policy address and what the underlying data actually supports are two different documents. My job is to read both simultaneously and show you where they align and where they diverge. Start with the trade diversification strategy. Canada is not starting from zero here, that matters. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union entered into force provisionally in 2017. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes Japan, Australia, Mexico, Vietnam, and several other Pacific economies, has been in effect since 2018. The Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement has been active since 2015. These are not decorative agreements. They are functioning legal frameworks with established tariff schedules, dispute resolution mechanisms, and institutional relationships already in place. What Carney's government is now attempting is to build upward from that foundation using existing agreements as leverage to accelerate new ones. One analytical interpretation worth considering: countries that are currently reassessing their supply chain dependencies may genuinely find Canada a more attractive negotiating partner in 2025 than they would have in 2020. Not because Canada has changed dramatically, but because the global risk calculus has shifted. Diversification away from single-source dependencies is now a strategic priority for many governments, particularly in energy and critical minerals. That is a real tailwind for Canadian trade policy. It is not, however, a guarantee of speed. The India file illustrates this precisely. The Canada-India Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement negotiations were formally suspended in September 2023. The diplomatic context surrounding that suspension involved serious allegations and a significant deterioration in bilateral relations. As of 2025, both governments have signaled willingness to re-engage, but willingness to talk and willingness to sign are separated by an enormous distance in diplomacy. Any analyst framing this negotiation as straightforwardly back on track is moving ahead of the available evidence. Now move to the energy layer. This is where the strategic logic becomes most compelling and most complex. The International Energy Agency reference in Carney's address is worth unpacking carefully. The IEA has consistently identified natural gas as a transitional fuel in its global energy scenarios, particularly for economies in Asia that are moving away from coal but are not yet positioned for full renewable integration. Canada's LNG export capacity, once fully developed, would position it to serve exactly that market. LNG Canada. Phase 1, located in Kitimat, British Columbia, is the largest private sector infrastructure project in Canadian history. It is operational. Phase 2 is under active development. These are not hypothetical projects. They are physical assets with defined timelines and contracted offtake agreements. The Darlington nuclear refurbishment in Ontario is proceeding on a multi-year schedule. Nuclear energy produces zero direct carbon emissions during operation, which aligns with Canada's low carbon positioning in international markets. The Mackenzie Valley Highway represents a different category of project. This is infrastructure that connects remote resource-rich regions of the Northwest Territories to southern supply chains. Its development has been discussed for decades. According to Carney's address, construction is beginning this summer. If that timeline holds, it would represent a meaningful acceleration of a project that has historically moved at a pace measured in political cycles rather than construction schedules. Here is the pattern I want you to see across all three of these energy projects. They are real, they are progressing, and they are large enough in scale that even partial completion meaningfully changes Canada's export capacity. But now look at the electricity commitment through a different lens. Doubling electricity generation in 25 years sounds like a long runway. In infrastructure terms, it is not. Grid-scale electricity projects, whether hydroelectric, nuclear, or renewable, have planning, environmental assessment, and construction timelines that routinely extend 10 to 15 years from initial approval to first power generation. That means decisions made in 2025 and 2026 will determine whether the 2050 target is achievable. The window for initiating those projects is not 2 decades away. It is now, which brings me to the investment figure that demands independent verification. Carney stated that foreign direct investment in Canada has reached its highest level in 2 decades, running at twice the rate of Canada's nearest G7 competitor when adjusted for economic size. That is a striking claim. Statistics Canada publishes quarterly foreign direct investment data. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development maintains comparable cross-country investment statistics. Before treating that figure as established fact, it needs to be cross-referenced against those sources. What I can say with confidence is this: the strategic logic underlying Canada's positioning is coherent. The foundational assets, energy resources, existing trade frameworks, political stability, rule of law are genuine. The question that serious analysts are asking is not whether Canada has the right ingredients. The question is whether the institutional machinery can move fast enough to convert those ingredients into delivered outcomes before the window narrows. And that question lands directly on the kitchen table of every Canadian household, which is exactly where we are going next. Let me bring this out of the parliamentary chamber and into your living room. Because everything we have discussed so far, the trade agreements, the energy strategy, the infrastructure commitments, ultimately translates into one of four things for ordinary Canadians: your electricity bill, your employment prospects, the price of goods you buy, and the long-term fiscal health of the government programs you depend on. Let me take each one seriously. Start with electricity costs. Doubling Canada's electricity generation capacity over 25 years is not a free exercise. Grid-scale infrastructure, whether hydroelectric dams, nuclear refurbishments, or large-scale renewable installations, requires substantial upfront capital investment. That capital comes from somewhere. In most cases, it comes from a combination of federal funding, provincial borrowing, and rate structures that are ultimately passed through to consumers and businesses. The long-term logic is sound. More domestic generation capacity reduces dependence on imported energy and creates pricing stability over time. But the transition period, the years during which new infrastructure is being built and financed before it generates revenue, carries real cost pressure. Household electricity rates in several Canadian provinces are already a point of political tension. That tension is unlikely to decrease during an aggressive build-out phase. The honest framing is this: lower long-term energy costs are a plausible outcome of this strategy. Higher near-term costs during the investment phase are also a plausible outcome. Both can be true simultaneously. Now look at employment. This is where the macro to micro translation is most direct and most positive. 22 nation-building infrastructure projects represent tens of thousands of construction, engineering, logistics, and trades positions. 1/3 of those projects are concentrated in British Columbia. The expansion of Port of Vancouver capacity alone, rail upgrades, road connections, terminal development generates sustained employment across multiple sectors and skill levels. LNG Canada, the Mackenzie Valley Highway, the Darlington nuclear refurbishment. These are not temporary projects. They are multi-year, in some cases multi-decade, employment anchors in regions that have historically experienced significant economic volatility tied to commodity cycles. For a skilled tradesperson in northern British Columbia or the Northwest Territories, this policy agenda represents something concrete, not a talking point, a job site. Now consider the export diversification impact on Canadian producers. Canada's agricultural sector, canola, wheat, pulses, seafood, and its critical minerals sector, potash, graphite, lithium, copper, stand to benefit meaningfully if new market access agreements with ASEAN economies and India reach conclusion. Asian middle-class consumption growth continues to drive demand for exactly the categories of products Canada produces at scale. If non-US export channels expand as targeted, Canadian producers gain pricing leverage they currently lack. When one buyer represents a disproportionate share of your market, that buyer has structural negotiating power over your prices. Diversification reduces that structural disadvantage. The qualification that matters here is timing. A producer making planting or investment decisions in 2025 cannot bank on agreements that are still in negotiation. The benefit is real, but it is forward dated. Finally, consider the fiscal dimension. Infrastructure investment at the scale Carney described requires significant federal expenditure. Canada entered 2025 carrying a debt load that is meaningful but not exceptional by G7 standards. The question fiscal analysts are watching is whether the revenue generation from expanded exports and increased economic activity materializes quickly enough to offset the front-loaded cost of the investment program. If it does, this strategy is self-financing over time. If execution delays push revenue generation further into the future while costs accumulate in the present, the fiscal arithmetic becomes more complicated. Here's the bottom line I want you to take from this section. The potential benefits of this agenda for ordinary Canadians are genuine. More jobs, more export markets, more energy security, more long-term pricing stability, but every single one of those benefits is conditional on execution speed, regulatory efficiency, and intergovernmental coordination delivering at a pace Canada has rarely demonstrated historically. The vision is on the table. The delivery is the variable. And that brings us to the final question, the one that actually determines which version of this future Canada ends up living in. I am not going to tell you how this ends, because nobody can. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you certainty they do not possess. What I can do is lay out the three most analytically defensible scenarios for where Canada's strategic positioning leads over the next 3 to 5 years, and let you decide which one the evidence points toward. Scenario 1. Execution matches ambition. The Mackenzie Valley Highway breaks ground on schedule this summer. LNG Canada. Phase 2 moves through its development timeline without significant regulatory interruption. At least 2 of the major trade negotiations, most plausibly with ASEAN economies, where diplomatic foundations are stronger, reach framework agreements by 2026. Foreign direct investment figures, when independently verified against Statistics Canada and OECD data, confirm the trend Carney described. In this scenario, Canada's non-US export share begins a measurable upward trajectory by 2027. The strategy is working. Scenario 2. Partial delivery with structural friction. Infrastructure projects proceed, but at timelines longer than announced. The India negotiation remains complicated by unresolved diplomatic sensitivities. Port of Vancouver expansion faces intergovernmental coordination delays between federal and provincial jurisdictions. Investment flows increase but concentrate in energy rather than distributing across sectors. Canada makes genuine progress on diversification, but falls short of the doubling target within the decade. The strategy is directionally correct but operationally constrained. Scenario 3. External disruption resets the board. A significant shift in U.S. trade policy in either direction alters the urgency calculation for Canadian diversification. A commodity price cycle downturn reduces the commercial attractiveness of several flagship projects. A geopolitical event in the Indo-Pacific disrupts the ASEAN negotiating environment. In this scenario, Canada's strategic pivot remains partially incomplete, and the window for optimal positioning narrows considerably. None of these scenarios is inevitable. All 3 are analytically plausible. The variable that most determines which path Canada takes is not global demand for Canadian resources. That demand appears genuine. The variable is domestic institutional velocity, the speed at which Canada's regulatory, intergovernmental, and financial systems can convert announced commitments into physical reality. That is the story I will be tracking on this channel, project by project, agreement by agreement, quarter by quarter. Now I want to hear from you. Which scenario do you think is most likely, and what piece of evidence is driving your assessment? Tell me in the comments below. If you want rigorous, fact-grounded analysis of Canada's economic and geopolitical positioning as this strategy unfolds, subscribe now, because this conversation is just getting started and the next development in this story may come sooner than anyone expects.